Making the perfect steak is actually quite easy. You don't need some fancy 5-star kitchen, you just need the right technique. Today I'm going to show you the only 2 methods you'll ever need to cook any size steak, starting with the butter basting method, and then the reverse sear method. Because steaks come in so many different shapes and sizes, I'm going to show you 2 different methods. The first being for smaller and thinner steaks, and the second being for larger and thicker ones. For the first method, I'll use this nice filet mignon. Although it's a bit tall, I still consider this a nice small steak, and it cooks quite fast. And for smaller or thinner steaks, you'll want to use the butter basting method. I'll start by seasoning my filet all over with a generous amount of salt, and then do the same thing with some fresh cracked pepper. You've probably heard of people resting their steak in the fridge overnight after seasoning it, but for a smaller or thinner steak, I typically don't recommend it since it could dry the steak out. But we'll try that method with our thicker steak later in the video. Once your steak is fully seasoned, you'll need a heavy bottomed pan of some kind. You'll get the best results with a cast iron or a nice heavy stainless steel pan. First, I'll cover the bottom of the pan with a nice layer of oil. I usually put a bit more oil than most chefs to make sure it gets all up in the nooks and crannies of the steak and gives you an even browning. Make sure you're using an oil with a nice high smoke point so it doesn't burn while you're cooking. Now is when we fire up the heat. The biggest difference between getting a perfect steak that you might eat at a restaurant is heat. You need to make sure you use high enough heat and you can't be scared of it. Just before searing, I'll add a touch of oil to the top of the steak, again making sure we get full coverage in all those nooks and crannies. And once our pan is ripping hot and our oil begins to barely smoke and shimmer, in we go with our steak pointing away from us and immediately press down. Just hold it for a few moments to make sure you fully press it down, and then turn your stove down to medium-low. Now leave it. Let it slowly dry out the edge of your steak and develop that crust. What you'll do next is get nice and low and look at the edges of your steak to look for that browning to begin. Control the temperature of your stovetop to make sure nothing's burning, but don't touch the steak. Watch that crust develop on the edges of your steak, and once you feel like it's that nice golden brown level, we can begin to flip. It's key that you keep a timer in your head the whole time, since we want to sear for the same amount of time on both sides. When you feel like you're ready to flip, turn the heat back up temporarily. Make sure your steak is loose from the pan. It should release like this all by itself, and then you can flip. There's our crust on one side, now we just have to get the other. Leave it at a nice high heat for a few more seconds, and once you feel like you've gotten that initial super high contact on the steak, turn down the heat once more. Another thing that I do to make sure I'm getting hot oil in all those nooks and crannies, which gives us that nice crust, is lift up the steak and reposition it over some new hot oil. At this point, once you've got that nice golden brown crust on both sides, carefully and safely pour off that oil and give your pan a quick wipe to get rid of all those bits that might burn. Once your pan's clean, put that steak back in, and then make sure you're at a very low temp. And now is when the fun begins. Half a stick of butter, or even a little more if you love butter as much as I do. 1 cut in half head of garlic straight into that butter. A few sprigs of fresh rosemary. Oftentimes, just to let all that butter heat up with those aromatics, I'll cheat the pan up on the flame so that the steak isn't really being cooked so much from one side directly anymore, and I just give that butter a few good moments to really infuse. Now to butter baste, I'll push all the aromatics to the top corner along with the steak, then I'll tilt the pan down towards me so all the butter falls and everything else stays, and begin spooning the butter over the top of my steak. This is called butter basting, and what we're doing right now is basically cooking our steak the rest of the way through by coating it over and over again with really hot, frothy, flavorful butter. It's one of my favorite things to do in the kitchen, not just because of the looks and feel of it, but also because of the smell. Just remember to keep that flame on a nice low temperature so your butter doesn't burn, and you should be able to cook it the rest of the way through with this nice brown butter the whole time. About halfway through the butter basting, I'm gonna flip my steak over just so it's sitting on the other side for the equal amount of time, and then I'll keep going. Once you've done this for just a bit longer, you wanna start thinking about checking the temperature of your steak. Since I like my steak medium, I'm going for about 140 to 145 Fahrenheit. I've been cooking steaks long enough now that I can just poke and pinch it a few times to know when it's done, and this one is ready to rest. Ooh. I can't forget this little trick that Gordon Ramsay taught me. Sit all those beautiful herbs and aromatics over the top of the steak, then dump that brown butter over it so that all that flavor continues to seep in as it rests. I know it's tempting to dive right into your steak, but resting allows those juices to really lock in. This one now has rested for about 10 minutes, so this is what I call the moment of truth. Ta-da! Perfect medium down the middle with a nice, thick and crispy crust that'll give us amazing texture just the way I like it. Spoon over some of that extra brown butter that we had from our pan, and then finish with a few of those really nice crispy rosemary bits. I don't even have to taste to know that that's a perfect bite of steak. I'm gonna taste it anyway. follow all those easy steps and you can do the exact same thing right at home. But before I get ahead of myself, in case you like to buy bigger and thicker steaks, let's go through the best method for that. The second technique is called the reverse sear method. This is better for thicker steaks. We start by cooking the steak in the oven, where it'll cook very evenly, and then finish it with a quick sear at the end to get that nice golden brown crust on both sides. I'm going to demonstrate this with one of my favorite cuts of steak, a nice thick ribeye. I'll start by seasoning all over both sides with a generous amount of salt, also making sure to cover all the edges of my steak. From this point here, you have two options. The first is place it in the fridge and sit it overnight. What that'll do is really season the steak with all that salt and dry out the edges, which will give you a nicer crust. Alternatively, you can cook it right away, but for that flavor and for that extra nice golden brown crust, I'm gonna place this in the fridge overnight. Luckily, so we don't have to wait, I've already prepped one of these ahead of time. And you'll notice right away that almost all of that salt has already dissolved into our steak. And if you listen, a nice hard crust has formed. Since the reverse sear method will cook this steak from the inside out, as opposed to that butter basting method where we started cooking from the outside in, our first step is to place this in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Since I like my steak medium, I'll check constantly with a thermometer until my steak's about 140 to 145 Fahrenheit. Once our steak gets to about 7 to 10 degrees away from where we want it to finish at, we can pull it out because now we have to get the sear. You can see that this one doesn't really look all that nice on the outside, but as they say, it's what's on the inside that counts. To sear, I'll fire up my burner to the highest temperature. We just need to finish it off and get that nice crust on the outside. For this steak, I'm using a classic cast iron skillet, which I'll add plenty of oil to the bottom of, just enough to make a nice layer at the base of my pan. And once I see a few ripples in my oil and it starts to shimmer and lightly smoke, into our pan we go. This time we'll keep the oil temp very high the whole time because we only want to sear quickly on each side to get that nice fast golden brown crust since the inside is already cooked. Once we have a nice crust on both sides, it's time to rest. I know you probably don't want to rest it, but just try to rest it for at least 10 minutes to lock in all those juices. And once we've rested for about 10 minutes, I usually like to take out this outer ribeye cap and just cut that up and eat it separately because these by themselves are very special fatty bites. And as for the steak itself, I'll trim it into a few nice thick pieces, then lay it down onto a nice plate, and then just for fun, I'll finish it off with a nice flavored butter. Then finish it with a few chives for color and a light dusting of fresh cracked pepper. Making the perfect steak is all about technique. You don't need any fancy equipment or a professional kitchen. You just need a good steak with the right technique. And that's how you cook a steak.